To understand why energy prices may never truly return to what they once were, you have to look at something most people rarely think about: the electricity grid itself. Most of the power infrastructure in countries like the United States was built decades ago, in a completely different era. An era where homes used far less electricity. No smart homes, no constant streaming, no electric vehicles charging overnight, no massive data centers powering artificial intelligence and the internet. Back then, the grid was designed for a simpler world. But today, demand for electricity is exploding. Every year, millions of new electric vehicles are added to the roads. Entire industries are shifting toward electrification. Even everyday appliances that once ran on gas are now being replaced with electric alternatives. And while demand keeps growing, the infrastructure supplying that energy is aging. Some power lines in the US are over 50 years old. Transformers are pushed to their limits. And, in many regions, energy companies are struggling just to keep up with the load. So when governments and utility companies say energy prices are rising because of market conditions, what they're really talking about is something deeper. A system under pressure. Add global instability to the mix. Supply chain issues, geopolitical tensions, rising fuel costs, and suddenly the price of generating electricity becomes far less predictable. And when electricity becomes unpredictable, prices rarely go down. In fact, many analysts believe we are entering a long-term era of energy volatility. Not constant crisis, but constant uncertainty. One winter storm can spike prices. One heat wave can overload the grid. One policy shift can raise costs across an entire region. And every time that happens, the bill lands in the same place: your mailbox. That's why something interesting has started happening over the past few years. Quietly and without much attention from mainstream media, thousands of homeowners have begun looking for ways to reduce how much they rely on the traditional power grid. Not because they want to live off-grid, but because they want something that feels increasingly rare in the modern energy world: control. Control over how their energy is produced. Control over how much they depend on large utility companies. Control over whether their electricity costs keep rising year after year or not. And that search for control has led some people down a very unexpected path. A path that most homeowners never even realize exists. And it starts with a surprisingly simple question. What if generating your own electricity at home wasn't as complicated or as expensive as most people have been led to believe? A few months ago, I came across a story that caught my attention. It wasn't on the news, and it wasn't trending anywhere. It was buried in a small online forum where homeowners were discussing something that sounded almost unbelievable at first. One man explained that after seeing his electricity bill climb for the third year in a row, he started researching ways to reduce his dependence on the grid. At first, he assumed the only real option was installing expensive solar panels. But when he looked deeper, he realized something surprising. There were people quietly experimenting with much simpler ways to generate small amounts of electricity at home. What fascinated him wasn't the idea of going completely off-grid. That wasn't his goal. His goal was simply to stop feeling completely powerless every time the energy companies raised their prices again. So he kept digging. He started reading about small-scale alternative energy setups. Simple systems designed to generate supplemental electricity using principles that have existed for decades. Nothing futuristic, nothing experimental. Just practical ways some people were using to produce a portion of their own power and reduce their reliance on traditional utilities. What he discovered was that a growing number of homeowners had begun exploring these kinds of solutions quietly, often building small systems themselves or following step-by-step guides created by engineers and energy enthusiasts. The interesting part was not that these systems could power an entire house overnight. That's not how most people use them. Instead, they use them the way many people use backup generators or solar supplements, to take pressure off their electricity usage, reduce their dependence on the grid, and regain at least some control over where their power comes from. And once that idea clicks, something shifts. Because the conversation stops being about waiting for energy prices to go back down. It becomes about whether it might actually be possible to rely a little less on a system that seems to be getting more expensive every year. That's when I started noticing that this topic is quietly spreading. More people are beginning to ask the same question that man asked when he first opened that shocking electricity bill. Not whether electricity will ever become cheap again, but whether there might be practical ways to start producing at least some of it themselves. As I kept looking into this, I realized something interesting. The reason most people never explore alternative ways to generate electricity at home isn't because it's impossible. It's because they assume it must be incredibly complicated. When people think about producing their own energy, they immediately imagine massive solar installations, complicated engineering, or systems that cost tens of thousands of dollars to set up. And for many households, that kind of investment simply isn't realistic. But the more I researched, the more I realized that a lot of people aren't starting with those large, expensive systems at all. Instead, they're learning about smaller, more accessible setups that use basic principles of energy generation, methods that engineers and hobbyists have known about for years. Systems designed not to replace the grid overnight, but to help people generate a portion of their own electricity using simple components and clear step-by-step instructions. That's when I stumbled across something that explained these ideas in a surprisingly practical way. It's a guide created by someone who spent years studying small-scale energy generation and alternative systems. Instead of presenting complicated theories, the guide focuses on showing ordinary homeowners how some people are, building simple energy devices at home using basic tools and affordable materials. What makes it interesting is that it doesn't promise miracles. It doesn't claim you'll suddenly power your entire home overnight. Instead, it shows how people are experimenting with ways to create supplemental electricity and reduce how much they rely entirely on the traditional grid. And considering where energy prices seem to be heading, it's easy to see why more people are becoming curious about ideas like this. Because the reality is, most of us can't control what utility companies charge next month. We can't control global energy markets. We can't control the policies that affect power generation. But learning how energy actually works and exploring ways to generate even a small portion of it yourself can change how dependent you are on that system. And that's exactly why so many people have started looking into resources like this one. At the end of the day, the truth is that no one really knows where energy prices will go in the next 5 or 10 years. Governments make predictions. Analysts publish reports. Utility companies promise stability. But if the past few years have shown us anything, it's that the energy world can change very quickly. Demand keeps growing. Infrastructure keeps aging. And every year, millions of people open their electricity bills hoping the number will somehow be lower than the month before. Sometimes it is, but very often it isn't. And that's why more and more homeowners are beginning to shift their mindset. Instead of waiting and hoping the system becomes cheaper again, they're starting to learn how the system actually works and what their options might be. Not to abandon the grid completely, but to depend on it a little less. Because when you understand how energy is produced and when you see the kinds of small-scale systems some people are building at home, you start to realize something important. The future of energy might not only belong to large power plants and massive infrastructure. Part of it may belong to ordinary people who simply decided to learn a little more about how electricity can be created right where they live. If you're curious about the guide I mentioned earlier, the one that explains how some homeowners are building simple alternative energy systems step by step, I left a link in the pinned comment below this video. You can take a look and decide for yourself whether it's something worth exploring. Because even if energy prices never return to what they used to be, understanding how energy really works might give you something that rising bills can't take away: control.